Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is David A. Hamburg, President Emeritus of the Carnegie Corporation. Dr. Hamburg was president from 1983 to 97. A psychiatrist, Dr. Hamburg was professor and chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford from 1961 to 72, president of the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. from 75 to 80, and John D. MacArthur Professor of Health at Harvard University from 80 to 82. In 1984 to 1985, he was president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 1983, he became president of the Carnegie Corporation. Dr. Hamburg, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you. Very glad to be back.
You've had a very interesting career: psychiatry, head of research institutes, and then president of a major foundation. How did your formative years point you in the direction of your life's work?
Well, it's a complicated question. I guess a couple of strands come to mind. In terms of medicine, I grew up in a family and a community which had very high esteem for medicine as a profession, as manifested in their attitudes toward the local family doctors and toward the Mayo Clinic and what have you. So there was that aspect of it. And my father himself, who was the son of an immigrant from Latvia, had really wanted to go to medical school, and indeed had wanted to do academic medicine at a time when there wasn't much academic medicine. But he really had to help his father basically bring people from the old country. The whole attitude was to bring as many family members as possible while there was still time. So he gave up that aspiration, and I suppose to some extent it was conveyed to me, but it was the image of it was a very humanitarian kind of a profession. A related aspect of it, though, that has to do with my later interest in war and peace and oppression and injustice was that I grew up in the time of the Holocaust. And even before there was a Holocaust, my grandfather, in the very beginning of the century, was deeply concerned about the fate of Jews in Europe. And the whole issue of anti-Semitism and its roots, and more broadly prejudice and ethnocentrism, were matters of considerable intellectual interest and emotional concern and perplexity in my family. And then when the Holocaust actually occurred, I recall vividly from my father particularly this not only deep regret and horror, but also intellectual curiosity. How could this happen? One of the most advanced countries in the world, Germany, where people went for advanced work in medicine and science and music and so on. How could it be that such a country could undertake such a slaughter? So I guess those are some of the strands of my early experience that certainly shaped my later professional interests.
In the introduction to your book, Today's Children, Creating a Future for a Generation in Crisis, you talk about your early family life and speak about the social support that your family provided. So I'm hearing a sense of the world's problems and intellectual problems, but also a very nurturing and supportive environment. Definitely
so, and that also, I'm sure, shaped a long-term interest in social support networks and the like. When my grandfather came here alone as a pushcart peddler without English language, with great courage as a kid, I was deeply impressed with and devoted to him. And he, at the same time, in a way, I think it heightened his appreciation of what it means to have a supportive family and a supportive community. And I wrote in Today's Children about how there was their house on 2nd Street in Evansville, Indiana. It was always open. It was open to the family, and we'd drop in 2 or 3 nights a week. At any given time, there were some configuration of family members present, and the message was, you're always welcome here. We have certain shared interests and values, and we have to prop each other up, particularly in times of stress.
And also exchanges of information. I read that also.
Very much so. It was like an information pool, and you could draw upon it. Everybody in the family would have something to put in, and it was shared, and it could help you taking advantage of opportunities or whatever might arise.
What books did you read as a young person that influenced you?
Well, I read a lot of current events and a lot of contemporary history. It was very much focused on the here and now, and then American novels, particularly in high school and college. I was very fascinated with a set of American novelists, Thomas Wolfe and John Steinbeck and Dos Passos, and to some extent Hemingway, to a lesser extent Faulkner. It was interesting. American history and American novelists of that period really were the focus of my attention.
And then, where did you go to college?
Indiana University.
Indiana University. And then on to medical school. And why, you discussed why you chose medicine, but what about psychiatry? Why did you wind up, do you think, specializing in psychiatry?
Well, there was really a prior step in why science, because although my father had an interest in academic medicine, there was very little about science in my hometown. And at any rate, whatever there was hadn't rubbed off on me particularly. But in a kind of busman's holiday fashion, I took an elective course in the then emerging science of genetics, mainly because I heard the teacher was terrific, although I thought it was fascinating somehow or other how it was that species would replicate themselves, and the subject matter did intrigue me, but it was more the teacher. And Professor Tracy Sonneborn turned out to be one of the pioneers of modern genetics and a brilliant teacher and an inspiration to me, and he turned me on to science. And from then on, I mean, the inherent intellectual curiosity that had been reinforced in the family was then shifted toward the scientific mode of inquiry, as well as the subject matter of genetics and the then emerging modern biology. So that really altered what I would do in medicine. And I went from the interest that was pre-medical in genetics to extending that to an interest in cellular physiology in medical school, again because of an excellent teacher, Professor Steer, and then to mammalian physiology and the physiology of the whole organism. How did the cells fit in the body? The body couldn't be just a collection of cells. They had, so to say, to talk to each other. And then in my senior year in medical school, I read Freud's General Introductory Lectures. I had always had curiosity about behavior for a variety of reasons. Some of it was family reasons. The nature of family relationships were much talked about and gossiped about at home. But also because of this Holocaust issue and the prior anti-Semitism in Russia. All of that had piqued my curiosity about why human beings behave as they do. So when I read Freud's General Introductory Lectures, it gave me a sense that there might be some organized, systematic way of inquiring into human behavior, and I even wondered if you could then relate it to human biology in some way. It was just a question in my mind in medical school. But what I actually saw, in fact, of psychiatry was very depressing in some respects. At the city hospital was more like prison than medical treatment. So I had to go on later in my career to find out whether there was more to psychiatry than that, and was there a way to really understand more about human behavior through psychiatry.
And what years were you in medical school, and where did you...
I graduated in 1947. It was a wartime speed up. And indeed, the Army sent me to medical school because the Army wanted as many doctors as possible as soon as possible. And I was very lucky in that respect. Because we didn't have a lot of money in the family, and the Army paid for my medical education, or most of it. And then that I'm sure that the reports of stress of wartime experience also shaped my interest towards psychiatry. And the single key event after Freud's lectures was reading a book by Roy Grinker and John Spiegel called Men Under Stress, Combat Reactions, and I was lucky enough to get to go and have an internship with Roy Grinker and John Spiegel. And that was the final thing that led me into psychiatry.
And then what was your main focus in psychiatry? Human aggression, or?
Well, initially it was stress responses. It was really the biology and psychology of human stress responses, undoubtedly influenced strongly by the wartime. experience. Grinker had made a number of clinical observations about reactions to stress, a severe and or prolonged stress, and I began to be curious how you could find out more about that. And so for a variety of complicated reasons, I went for a year to Yale with the notion of coming back to Grinker the following year in Chicago. And during that year at Yale, I heard a lecture by a Hungarian emigre in Canada, Hans Selye, a pioneer in the endocrinology of stress, the hormonal reactions to stress, particularly the hormones of the adrenal cortex, although there was prior work by the great Harvard physiologist Walter Cannon on the adrenal medulla's response to stress. And so I began to get into that line of work. And as I proceeded with that line of work, I got very much interested in how it was that people cope with stressful experiences. So those two lines went along mostly in parallel, sometimes intersecting, the coping behavior on the one hand and the biological responses, mainly hormonal, but also to some extent cardiovascular and other biological responses to stress.
And you maintained all this time a kind of a broader interest in society and in the context in which these conditions occurred?
Yes, mostly in the back of my mind, at least professionally, but in the front of my mind personally, you know, avidly following the wartime and post-war developments, being appalled by, as the news came out, the actual events of the Holocaust being even worse than we had anticipated, many other things of that sort, and the question of how a post-war structure could be created that might prevent World War III. Those things interested me as a citizen, but I had no professional involvement in them. However, as I went along with the stress interest, it was true, as you suggested a moment ago, that a branch off the stress tree is human aggressiveness and conflict resolution. Surely among the most stressful, difficult, troubling of all human experiences are those involve aggression, violence, conflict, and so gradually the attention I paid to that aspect of stress response increased over the years.
In your distinguished career, we can't cover it in its entirety. You've been chairman of an academic department, you've been head of a research institute, and lastly head of a major American foundation. What is distinctive about being the head of a foundation that differs from the other two roles, the head of a research institute or an academic department?
Well, whatever else is true, that when you're in academic life, for research, particularly and to some extent for education, you need to raise money outside the university, and then when you go to a foundation, you don't have to raise money anymore, so that, as a friend of mine once said, who made a similar transition, it's better to give than not to receive. But it is true that it's a different set of reflexes, so to say, when you think about making grants that will be useful in trying to develop a strategy that would have some real leverage for amplifying the work of your grantees. That's different than applying for grants yourself for a line of inquiry that you're familiar with.
Tell us a little of the history of the Carnegie Corporation. It was a gift from Andrew Carnegie.
Yes. He was a fascinating man who decided early in life he was going to make a lot of money and give it all away in his lifetime. He came here as a poor boy from Scotland at age 12 with socially concerned parents, very much preoccupied with how the world could be a better place. And he did indeed make a lot of money, and he did indeed give it away in his lifetime. He formulated this notion of a gospel of wealth, which was essentially that it's a crime for a rich man to die rich, that wealth is a social trust. You should enjoy it, but at the same time you should make it available for larger public purposes. And he did a variety of philanthropic activities over a period of decades, but then he sold his company to J.P. Morgan, a back-of-the-envelope deal, rather different from today's elaborate contracts, and I think it was the biggest deal in history, some hundreds of millions of dollars, which on today's market would be many billions of dollars. And then he realized, well, he didn't have any clear-cut way to deal with this for the long term. How would he give it away? And he invented the concept of a general purpose foundation and empowered his board to use the money any way they saw fit over an extended period of time. He felt that he and probably nobody had the wisdom to predict what would be important in 30 or 50 years. And the general notion was more or less that you'd spend the income off the capital and you would do things in perpetuity that would be useful for the public good. And he gave a very broad mandate that it was to be for the dissemination of information for the well-being of the people of the United States, and then he added in for the people of the British Commonwealth, which was a large part of the world at that time, 1911, when he set up the foundation.
I get the sense in looking at the work of your foundation during your tenure that the head of a foundation really stands at as a bridge in a way between theory and practice.
Yes.
That a lot of your work is about finding the right ideas and putting them, making them effective in society. Is that a fair assessment of that role?
Well, I think so, at least in the way I see the role. Now, you should understand that foundations differ enormously one from another, and different foundation presidents will interpret the role differently, and the mandates given by the founders differ a lot. Carnegie gave us a very broad mandate. At the same time, I felt we should pay attention to his own patterns of philanthropy and his own outlook to a considerable degree. We should do that. And it was clear to me that he was interested in the connection between ideas and social action. He was interested in the connection between technological advances and social improvement. And he had two great themes of philanthropy in his life, peace and education. And I felt we should pursue those. The foundation had always pursued education in one way or another, but had been rather variable in its pursuit of peace, and I thought we ought to come back to that, especially since we were in the depths of a Cold War exacerbation after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And in pursuing those two themes, not just those two, but mainly those two, I felt that there was an important interface between research and social action. That we should bring to bear the best possible evidence that came from the sciences and scholarship, and carefully assessed innovations in clinics or schools or wherever, and try to think carefully about how that insight and that information and that evidence might be brought to bear in a way that could be socially useful on a broad scale.
In a moment, we're going to talk about the two major topic areas that you really made a major contribution to, preventing deadly conflict and the problem of youth in the United States. But there were some common themes to both that I wanted to address first. And one is, I sense in reading some of your writings, your sensitivity to both the hope and the dislocation that progress can create. Would you talk a little about that? Because my sense is that in your work you are working to create pathways that allow us to overcome those dislocations.
Right. Well, later as my career developed, I moved beyond the preoccupation with contemporary issues that had characterized my childhood and youth, and became very much interested in evolution and history, and really devoted a lot of time and energy, far more than I ever anticipated, and I hope some thought to the long history of our species. And in the course of that, I really was struck by the fact that phases of technological advance offered great hope and possibility and opportunity. At the same time, were typically associated with massive social dislocation. And I suppose the Industrial Revolution is as good an example as any, which on the one hand made it possible for a great many people to live well, indeed for many to live as kings and queens of some centuries back could not live, and yet also had just powerful dislocations as people came from the countryside into a factory system that was almost like prisons, and urban crowding which exposed them to diseases which they never had before, and on and on and on. And indeed, in due course, those massive dislocations were associated with the rise of communism and fascism, so that here you had tremendous opportunity and genuine social advance, and yet and yet deadly conflicts and other side effects that were not anticipated. So that I came to feel that one of the greatest challenges for contemporary humans is the democratic and judicious and humane uses of science and technology.
And as one finds the paths out of this quagmire that is sometimes created, one also finds, and you speak a lot about this in your writings, namely the atavisms, either in political institutions or in the human organism itself that prevents us moving on to the next stage. Tell us a little about that. I mean, it seems to be something that comes up a lot in your writings.
Well, I believe that to some degree we carry over dangerous legacies from the past, often patterns of behavior that were very likely adaptive, maybe even highly adaptive for millennia, for perhaps even millions of years. And then with the historically rapid transformation, it's only, for example, 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. That's a moment of time. The electronic revolution, a matter of decades, you know. So we in very recent times face situations that are so different than those in which we evolved. I believe that to some extent in the genes and to some extent in our customs, we carry over dangerous patterns of behavior. Let me give you just one example, and I think it's a very powerful one. We evolved in small groups, face-to-face, intimate groups of familiarity, largely through the lifespan, where changes were slow, and the rules you learned in childhood guided you about what you had to do to adapt. And we have a powerful clinging to our groups, as we should have. It was essentially that what we taught our children for probably millions of years was essentially belong to survive. Belong to survive. You have to be part of the group to have the capacity to deal with the vicissitudes of the environment that you would have to face. Now, that's fine, and we still have that sense, and there's much that's positive about it, as I wrote about in Today's Children. On the other hand, it puts us at risk when we go over to hating other groups so easily as we do, the in-group, out-group distinctions that we make in such a ubiquitous way. Very easy to learn, probably having some biological background. But when you say, well, my primary group is everything and other groups are to be viewed with suspicion and disdain, in the contemporary world that becomes exceedingly dangerous. And so we have to find ways to maintain identification with a small group that is fundamentally supportive, but also to enlarge our social identifications to encompass what we in fact are, a worldwide, highly interdependent single species. And psychologically, that's very hard. There's hardly anything in our background as a species to prepare for identifying with the whole big wide world.
When one looks at these two problems, youth and preventing deadly conflict, it seems that with regard to both sets of studies, the first step that I marked down here was really insight and understanding through research. So in a way, as in your role as head of the foundation, you have to both support research and find what's out there to come up with a compendium of what we know, where we are on the particular issue.
Exactly so.
And let's look at the issue of violence, preventing deadly conflict. How did you undertake that responsibility when you decided to focus on that issue?
Well, in the Carnegie years, it's 15 years as president of Carnegie, what we did with respect to children influenced the way I came to structure the problem with respect to preventing deadly conflict. Just as you say, we went to the research evidence and asked, what do we know about the essential requirements for healthy child development, healthy in the broad sense, for kids to have a decent chance to grow up inquiring and problem solving, healthy and vigorous, decent and constructive. What do we know about that? And then to ask, well, to what extent are those essential requirements for healthy development being met under contemporary conditions? And where they're not met, what adjustments can be made by the pivotal institutions that have the power to shape development? What adjustments can they make to be more effective and more constructive? Starting with the family, but going on to schools and the healthcare system and the community-based organizations and religious institutions and the media. And then what can the powerful institutions surrounding, like government and business and the scientific community, do to help these pivotal frontline institutions do what's necessary to give kids a decent chance? That was the kind of intellectual structure, and in the course of that, going from research to social action. Now, like the man who was speaking prose all his life and didn't realize it, I sort of woke up one fine day and thought that same intellectual structure applies to preventing deadly conflict. What does it take for people to live peacefully together? Partly it's a developmental question. How can they grow up in such ways as to diminish prejudice and ethnocentrism and learn to live together? But partly it's an intergroup question, international question, but still, what does the research evidence tell us about the conditions under which that can happen? Foster peaceful living, essentially, that overcome conflicts before they become violent. Conflicts are ubiquitous. This is a contentious species, but they don't have to pass the threshold to mass violence. When do they and when don't they pass that threshold? So very careful scholarship on those issues does exist, and we tried to strengthen it and fill some gaps. And then to begin to ask, well, okay, if we know that, about the favorable conditions and the unfavorable conditions for going toward mass violence, what institutions have something to say about it, and how could those institutions be strengthened to prevent mass violence? In this case, the institutions were governments and international organizations, both global and regional, and the institutions of civil society that have great potential in this regard. Business and scientific community, educational institutions, religious institutions, the media, and non-governmental organizations that focus on conflict. We felt that the institutions of civil society have a role to play greater than the past, could augment what governments do and what intergovernmental organizations do. So it was the same kind of logic from research to social action.
And it's really defining the point of intervention once you have the research, trying to figure out how one can most usefully intervene to create the conditions that you desire.
Right, and one part of it that was brought home to me by our work with children and youth, but also by our work during the Cold War on US-Soviet relations, was that you need to give a lot of attention, perhaps more than most foundations have up to now, to two ways of moving toward implementation of knowledge and skill. One is systematic ways of bringing scientists and scholars and other independent experts together with policymakers for mutual benefit, so that the policymakers can be informed by the research evidence and the best available innovations in their field, and on the other hand, so that scientists and scholars and other experts could be stimulated to look more deeply into questions that are highly salient for policymakers. So that linkage of the policy community with the scholarly community was something that we pursued during the Cold War in international relations, and have developed further in this latest report on preventing deadly conflict. And so too with children and youth, that linkage. The other point is to somehow generate public understanding, and it's very, very hard to do that. That partly means a higher level of attention in colleges and universities, and even in K-12 schools, more serious, disciplined education on the critical issues, whether it be child and adolescent development on the one hand, or preventing deadly conflict on the other. And it also means, to the extent possible, discussion of these issues by the public at large, through community organizations, through the media. The media, of course, have enormous potential for illumination, but it's no simple matter by any means to get adequate, fair, accurate treatment. But still, it is possible, and some good things have happened in that regard. But those are two issues: enhancing public understanding and linking independent experts with policymakers, that I believe are vitally important if you're serious about translating research to social action for important matters of public good.
And in the public education side, there's also an element of trying to build a new political consensus on an issue, because at a certain point in both of these issues, both youth and preventing deadly, don't you run up against the politics of the issues and the interests that are vested and don't want to, move in a new direction?
Well, I think from the standpoint of foundations, as they're chartered under American law and as they've mainly pursued their activities in practice, they have to do whatever they do in a nonpartisan way. At least that's my own view, that we address great issues that concern everybody. It's hard to see how, regardless of political party or ideological bent, you wouldn't want children to grow up inquiring and healthy and decent. It's hard to see how that's a partisan matter, fundamentally. Similarly, it's hard to see why it would be anybody's interest to take great interest of, let's say, blowing up the world. It's not obvious that that should be a partisan matter, although I recognize that in every country it's quite possible to turn any important issue into a partisan controversy. But we have tried very hard to do whatever we do in ways that would bring the best available information, well documented, to the attention of people right across political lines. Not to avoid the political community, not to avoid political problems. That's an important part of human experience and of social reality. But to do it in a way that is respectful of different political parties and perspectives and positions, but to put it out there to try to build a better factual base on which policymakers of different political backgrounds can make decisions, or in which citizens can make better decisions.
In some ways, you got your feet wet on these issues as a foundation director in your early work at the foundation on USSoviet relations, yes, and preventing nuclear conflict. In retrospect, how do you think that work contributed to the ultimate resolution, in the sense that the Soviet Union, as we knew it, collapsed, and those issues, not the nuclear issue, but rather the political confrontation between the Soviet and the U.S. ended?
I could perhaps best be descriptive. I do believe that, that we played a useful role. It's impossible, I think, for me or probably for anybody to say how useful it was. There are some distinguished figures in public life who have spoken to the value of the contribution. Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar would be two examples. Gorbachev would be an example. President Clinton is an example. People in public life who have said that the Carnegie contribution on this problem was worthwhile, was constructive, and I'm very pleased. It's such an important problem that if you can make a little contribution at the margin, it's worthwhile. Now, operationally, in essence, what we did that I think has lessons for other foundations and for universities and other people at large beyond the Cold War, we first of all tried to draw together the best available scientists and scholars to work on various facets of the problem: arms control, crisis prevention, the origins of the Cold War, conceivable paths out of the Cold War. Maybe the most challenging thing we did was to bring together scientists and scholars at a number of major universities like Berkeley and say to them, think hard about how a nuclear war could actually start, and then think hard about preventive measures that might be taken on each path to a nuclear war. That very simple proved to be very stimulating, I think. Then rather quickly, as the work evolved, as some brilliant people on this campus and elsewhere worked those problems, we tried to find ways to bring them together with policymakers in our own country, on neutral turf, to try out these ideas. And then before long, we brought them together with counterparts on the Soviet side, scientists and scholars, the best we could connect with, not political hacks or KGB types, but eminent people matched with ours to think about arms control and crisis prevention particularly, and later on, after Gorbachev, a broader range of issues. Eastern Europe and Third World flashpoints, and indeed how we might get out of the Cold War altogether. But that was only possible meaningfully after Gorbachev came to power. But arms control and crisis prevention were meaningful earlier. But in any event, so you had US-Soviet joint study groups working together. Now, one thing that happened was that after Gorbachev came to power, some of these scientists and scholars on the Soviet side had walk-in access to him. They became very important advisors to him in his early years, and through them I met him early and to some degree became a broker for Western people and Western ideas. He wanted that. He had immense intellectual curiosity, and we tried to help him meet that curiosity. So on the U.S. side, we also had many feedback loops of this work to presidents, to President Reagan, to President Bush, and to the leaders in the Congress, both parties and both houses, tried to find ways in which, not with conclusions and or any kind of dogmatism, but rather let us open our minds to a wider range of possibilities. At the time of the deepest Cold War confrontation, I think there's an important general lesson in this, we and the Soviets were both fixed on a very narrow range of possibilities, like Dorothy Parker, in commenting on some famous actress, opening night said, last night so-and-so ran the gamut of emotions from A to B. and we were running the gamut of policy options with respect to the Cold War from A to B. And I think foundations, by stimulating and supporting work in universities and research institutes, were able to open up a larger number of possibilities, and thoughtful policymakers and informed concerned publics took that seriously.
Cold War ends, but we're then presented with, we thought initially a new world order, but it turned out to be a new world of disorder, and that is the issue that the Carnegie report addressed on preventing deadly conflict and so on. What is it about this new world order that creates so many trouble spots where violent conflict rears its head in a way that it didn't before?
Well, I don't pretend to understand all of it, but there are a few important factors that I think have become reasonably clear, especially in the work of this worldwide commission that I had the privilege of co-chairing with Cyrus Vance on preventing deadly conflict. I think we did illuminate some things. One aspect of it is that during the Cold War, we and the Soviets sat in a lot of conflict. We stirred up a lot too, but we did suppress conflicts that might have become much more dangerous in terms of the logic of the Cold War. Once the Cold War was over, neither we nor the former Soviet Union had much inclination to suppress conflicts. We were rather inclined to withdraw and look after our own people and let nature take its course, and many of the conflicts seemed very far away to us, rather remote from our own vital interests. Whether that's true or not, that's the way it looked to us. Now then, some things were happening. One was that some ancient hatreds came back to life that were no longer held in check by us. However, that to some degree has been exaggerated, because it's a bit too simple in most of these conflicts to say that it was just an ancient hatred that came back to life. Commonly, the ancient hatred was in a context when it became really violent. The context often included another dangerous element, namely the erosion of social norms, as happened when the Soviet Union fell apart. If you didn't have the communist structure, what did you have? And for a while you didn't have much of anything, and people didn't know what would hold their lives together. Moreover, you had there, and in Africa particularly, the decline of governance, so that a government which could provide some services and could provide some ground rules and could hold people together now fell into decline. So you had an erosion of the capacity to govern, you had an erosion of social norms, and oftentimes an economic free fall, or at least a serious fear of economic erosion and the lack of a clear-cut economic system, so that all that together made for a lot of fear in a lot of places. And that fear was typically played upon by political demagogues. in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, and elsewhere, and then you would come putting gasoline on the embers of the ancient hatreds. Look, we can only survive by bashing, killing, eliminating these ancient enemies of ours. If we do that, we'll have better economic conditions, we'll seize their assets, whatever, we'll have a higher status, we'll have a way to live, so that the ethnic and religious animosities, important as they are tend to be part of a complex of factors, all of which together make for mass violence.
What was the formula in this not very simple set of problems that we're talking about that the Commission came up with as at least a pathway to addressing some of these problems?
We decided, after looking at these conditions that are conducive and have recently been conducive to violent conflict, that we had to extend our range from interstate warfare to intrastate mass violence, civil war, ethnic conflict, what have you, which, by the way, has great spillover potential anyway, so that it tends to fuzz the distinction between intra and interstate warfare. But nevertheless, we had to spend a lot of our time looking at intrastate conflicts as they boiled up, partly because the earlier thinking, like the formation of the UN and the Marshall Plan, dealt with interstate war, and the international institutions and governments were not well prepared to deal with this heavy outbreak of intrastate fighting. That's one thing. Then we decided, well, who could do what? We had to try to delineate to some extent who could do what with respect to preventing passing the threshold from conflict to mass violence. And that led us to broaden our horizons from governments and international institutions like the UN and regional intergovernmental organizations like the Organization of American States to institutions of civil society. And so we looked at business and religion and education and science and media and non-governmental organizations. And in each case, right along the line, governments and international organizations and institutions of civil society, we asked, what have they done up to now? Answer, not much, mostly in prevention terms. Although there are some good exceptions. We tried to find the exceptions, cherish the exceptions, highlight them in the report. If it's happened once or twice, it could happen more. It could happen again. What could make it happen again? What ideas would tend to strengthen the capability of each institution in turn to prevent deadly conflict? And that's the structure we followed. Now, in order to do that, we felt we could not just look at the immediate crisis. That's what we call operational prevention. That's very important. You have two groups coming toward the deadly collision, and what can you do in the way of preventive diplomacy and economic sanctions and economic inducements and even a rapid deployment capability of military force to separate the antagonistic parties? That's important. There's a lot that can be done in operational prevention, but we decided, but what then? Supposing you get that job done and you stop the immediate conflagration, the fire is likely to break out in 5 or 10 or 20 years again, and maybe even worse. So we had to think about what we call structural prevention. Structural preventions. What are the conditions conducive to living peacefully in the long term? And there you get into issues of economic and social development. You get into issues of building democracy around the world, of finding structures to protect human rights. Our shorthand for it is security, meaning arms control and the like, diminishing the threat of pervasive armaments. Second shorthand is well-being, which deals with issues here and abroad of economic and social development. And then justice, some notion of a just society in terms of an independent judiciary and other things of that sort, building of democratic institutions. So security, well-being, justice for the long term, and asking what can each country do in that respect, but what can the international community do, particularly to help fragile democracies, countries that have been in deep trouble, failed states. Is that beyond human ingenuity? We don't think so.
And in terms of the short term, early warning systems become very important.
Yes.
Information about what is going on in a particular setting.
Very important. And we have a special monograph on that done by a member of the Commission, Professor Alexander George of Stanford, a great scholar in international relations, and the executive director, Dr. Jane Hall, who who actually took her PhD with Alex George. They did a monograph on early warning and early response. I would just make one particular point about early warning, and that is that one of the best, most meaningful predictors in the set of various early warnings is an upsurge, a sharp upsurge of egregious human rights violations. That tells you that it's highly probable in that setting there will be some outbreak of very serious fighting. And it also tells you you've got to think for the longer term about how you build institutions and processes that will protect human rights from large-scale egregious violations. But on the whole, we conclude that the problem today, with all the information available, all the intelligence for the whole wide world, that the problem is not so much early warning as early response. What do you do to respond to the information you have that something dreadful is about to occur?
We don't have time to go into detail about your work on children and your book, Today's Children, but I'm curious, are you more sanguine now about our society's commitment to addressing the immense array of problems that have troubled the situation of young people?
Yes, I am. I think there's still a long way to go, and maybe you have to be optimistic when you tackle very hard, almost intractable problems, as I do habitually. But still, if you just take concretely, just take one case in Today's Children. In my years at Carnegie, we focused very heavily on two periods because they're crucially formative and associated with high vulnerability but great potentiality. One is 0 to 3, conception to 3, and the other is early adolescence, 10 through 14. And if you take 0 to 3, it has simply come alive. And I'm proud to say, perhaps delusionally, that we had something to do with that. There were many other factors. But the situation today is so much better than it was even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, in 0 to 3. There's a tremendous amount of interest. Just before I came here, I saw the National Governors Association on C-SPAN, and time after time in recent years, every meeting, they've focused on 0 to 3. They have a multiplicity of initiatives. I've had the privilege of addressing them several times. The National Governors Association, there have been several White House conferences which I've had the privilege to participate. There have been national television specials, particularly Rob Reiner has spearheaded a whole big media campaign drawing on the scientific and medical information. We have a ferment in the country, many magazine articles, newspaper coverage. That was a very quiet, if not dead subject 10 years ago. And it's a very live subject today, and all kinds of initiatives taking place. The business community has come alive on 0 to 3. So there is at least a decent fighting chance that our youngest children will have a new set of opportunities, a reinvigoration of possibilities beyond anything I could have imagined 10 years ago.
What are the lessons learned from your career about the work of foundations in our society?
Well, foundations have great opportunities. They're very fortunate. They're really blessed. They have the scope and flexibility. The way the laws are written and the customs has evolved, and I must say the leadership of Andrew Carnegie and the broad mandate that he gave, they have scope and flexibility to address a very wide range of problems, including extremely hard problems that people would rather not think about, that look truly intractable. They have a wonderful kind of Piper capacity to get the best minds, brilliant, dedicated scientists, scholars, innovators on the street, wherever, to work on problems with a little bit of support. So you have that effect of mobilizing terrific people to work on very important problems, and you have the scope and flexibility to go wherever the evidence leads you. That is a great privilege, and I think on the negative side, we must not make ourselves bureaucratically rigid or overly fearful. We are meant to be the venture capital and nonprofit sector, but we have some tendency to be risk averse. We mustn't be risk averse. We will draw some criticism if we support brilliant, innovative people working on hard social problems. We have to be responsible and careful about it, but we must take the chances of addressing those problems.
What has been your greatest frustration and your greatest satisfaction in the work that you've done?
In the foundation?
Yes,
years?
yeah.
I must say, I can't readily identify any great frustration except that what is called in the foundation community the scale-up problem. That is, if you're able to support on a small scale some terrific innovation based on the best available research, and you can demonstrate with evaluative research that it's really useful, that it does work, that you can take poor kids and turn them on to science education, for example, and open up pathways in which they were thought to be, just out of the question. And you can do it in 3 communities or 6 or 20 communities, and you desperately want to make that available to the whole country. It's very hard to do. You don't have the money. Where is the money? You can turn to the business community, you can turn to state governments, federal governments, and you can enhance public understanding. It's in the long run, it tends to happen. In the short run, it's very frustrating when you can see good things that get done, lives being warped, even destroyed, and you can't move fast enough to apply the knowledge and skill that exists. That's a great frustration. But on the positive side, you can open up so many doors of opportunities, and you can stimulate so much creativity that it's an immense privilege to be able to work for an American foundation.
One final question. What would be your advice to students who might want to do foundation work, A, and work on either of these 2 problems that we've talked about, the situation of youth and preventing deadly conflict?
Well, I would say to get first of all a deep knowledge in some problem area. That doesn't mean necessarily a single discipline, although you typically start with a single discipline, but to be mindful that the problems of the real world don't come in neat packages that fit any single discipline, and so you broaden your horizons in order to get deep knowledge of some particular problem area, and have a sense of rootedness in that knowledge and skill. But then to kind of keep scanning for how your professional knowledge might be usefully applied in a social context. It could be done even in college, in volunteer work, or in other ways that you're constantly probing, exploring to see the extent to which your knowledge could be put to work for the benefit of people beyond your own immediate family. That can be done and can grow over time. Foundations are strange creatures, and there's no single pathway, no obvious professional pathway into the foundation community. People come out of many different backgrounds, but I think to have a reasonably broad base of knowledge and to keep flexible so you can adapt your knowledge to different situations is a cardinal criterion for being successful in the foundation community.
Dr. Hamburg, thank you very much for spending this time with us and talking about your work at the Carnegie and your life's work.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back with you again after these years.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining me for this conversation with history.